I'm Jane Nolan, the Maps and GIS librarian in UCD Library. And on behalf of myself and Liz Bruton here, the Communications and Engagement Officer in UCD's Earth Institute, we are delighted to welcome Martin Brocklehurst today. And Martin is a founder of the European Citizen Science Association and the Citizen Science Global Partnership. As an aside, I'm happy to say that UCD has joined the European Citizen Science Association, and Martin will be mentioning some of the benefits of membership in his presentation. He is on the board of both organizations and currently chairs the board of the CSGP, that's the Citizen Science Global Partnership, and he has a history of working to deliver environmental change in the public, private and academic sectors, and has acted as an advisor to multinational companies, UK governments, parliamentary committees, and the United Nations Science Policy Business Forum on how to achieve environmental change. He has lectured extensively on the opportunity citizen science now presents to achieve a fundamental shift in human behaviour to tackle the great environmental challenges of our time. He currently works as part of a project, Aurora, an EU-funded citizen science programme acting on climate change and empowering a new generation of near zero emissions. And I'm happy to say he leads by example in his private life, making the journey with his family towards being near zero carbon emission citizens. And on that note, I'll hand you over to Martin. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be at University College Dublin to talk about what's been happening with citizen science. I won't spend any more time on myself other than to focus on the title of my talk, that the decade of citizen science is here, and be part of it. It's been a long journey since 2013, when citizen science was hardly heard, certainly in the policy framework. And if you went back to the European Union at that time, you could find the word citizen science mentioned once in 2013 in any of the documentation in the EU. But more of that in a moment. Let me see if it works. No, we don't, it's not working. Try again. Can I try that? There we go. I work a lot of the time with the United Nations. The last 4 or 5 years. Oh, we've gone again. There we go. I work a lot of my time with the United Nations. And if you listen to the Secretary General of the UN, the words "mankind is now on the highway to hell" or "a livable future." So those are the words of Antonio Guterres, who says we have a stark choice to change or unleash catastrophic global consequences, not just from climate change, but also from biodiversity loss and pollution. And I can say, attending some of the UN meetings, it is now very depressing, because for many years, the UN has been telling the scientific community, has been telling governments that there is a need for fundamental change in these 3 big areas of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And this was really rammed home to me when I went to a UN Science Policy Business Forum meeting in Canberra in Australia. And they were then going through one of the biggest droughts in the history of Australia, 2 years after the biggest drought that Australia had ever seen. So these were like 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year events. And in the Murray-Darling Basin, as I flew back, and this is taken from the plane I flew back from in Australia, the whole place was alight. The river systems in that Murray-Darling Basin were dry. So ocean-going vessels were on the dry bed of rivers that normally supplied the water supply for the communities living there. This is the stark consequences of climate change in a country that's on the edge. And if I go back to my history in the Environment Agency and listening to the chief scientist at the time, the chief scientist of the UK was talking about the areas that are on the front line of climate change, and the Murray-Darling Basin is one of them. And it's also one of the areas that produces agricultural surplus. So you get the worst of all worlds. You lose food production and you lose the ability to live in places like the Murray-Darling Basin as a direct consequence of climate change. At that? Yeah. No, do you want to advance it for me? Obviously not working. Yeah. Okay. After I left, the situation in Australia got worse. And if you remember the fires in New South Wales, these were fires in places where there had never been bushfires. Whole communities wiped out. And this was at a time when the Australian government was arguing to reopen coal-fired power stations in a country on the front line. And the quote on the top, and I won't give you the full quote because it's quite rude, was from some local residents who were complaining that the government was telling the civil servants in Australia not to link the fires to climate change. And you can see the reaction there. This is clearly as a result of climate change in Australia. And it has resulted now in some fairly big changes, because we're seeing protests growing as governments are pressed to move more quickly on climate change and for companies to align with the Paris Commission targets. And anybody who has witnessed the ruined lives, the misery, the destitution, and the massive economic damage that these climate change events create will know we have to change. Yet, despite these protests, we stubbornly resist fundamental change. And the most recent example of that is at the BP shareholders meeting on the 27th of April, 2023, when this question about aligning with the Paris Commission targets was put to the shareholders of BP and rejected by both the shareholders and the board. So the pace of change remains glacially slow, and carbon levels continue to rise in our atmosphere. So the question for me is, what can we do as citizens to drive change? Can we drive change? And I believe the answer is yes. But even when you come to Ireland, you look at citizens in Ireland, they continue their lives much unchanged, either unaware of the impending challenges or indifferent to the changes we all need to make. How many of the citizens here are aware of their carbon footprint? How many have taken fundamental decisions to reduce that carbon footprint in line with the Paris Commission targets? So although we can criticize BP, when we look at ourselves, we have to ask the question, are we doing enough? And I often hear people say, but it doesn't matter. You know, I'm insignificant. But actually, if we start to band together as citizens, we become very significant, because we as individuals are responsible for nearly 30% of all carbon emissions. And unless we change, we won't hit the targets. So if you look across the UK at the moment, you find that the government and the energy companies are starting to drive carbon down. But the areas that are not changing, stubbornly staying the same or going up, are related to transport, heating, energy, lighting, all the things, all the decisions that we take. And if I go back to 2007, when the Stern report was prepared, he laid out the stark economic reality of why we needed to take action 16 years ago. And yet 16 years later, the carbon levels in our atmosphere are still rising. The international agreements that we put in place to drive change haven't worked. They need greater support if they're going to deliver. And I fundamentally believe that the multilateral agreements, which are the best tool that we have to drive global change, have a democratic and economic deficit at their heart that hinders our progress. That it's not our ambition that's failing, but our execution of that ambition. And the recent carbon tracker initiative has now suggested that we only have 7 years left to get our carbon levels down if we want to stay within the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures. And that's with a 66% probability. The Global Carbon Project suggests it might be 9 years, but it's not a very long time period. So we should be treating this problem in the same way that we treated COVID, and not hiding behind the fact that it's an incremental change process, because if we don't, in 6 to 9 years' time, it will be too late. So one of the things that I believe passionately is that citizen science is potentially a new tool in the armory that we can actually use to reinforce the international agreements that are being put in place, what we call multilateral agreements. Because it's not the agreements that are wrong, it's the implementation of the agreements that's failing. That is why in 2013, the EU Environment Minister, Janusz Potočnik, and Professor Jacqueline McGlade, who's a lady on the extreme left, the chief scientist to be at UNEP, spent time nurturing the formation of the European Citizen Science Association, ECSA for short. They saw the democratic opportunity that citizen science presented, that with the use of new technology, it is possible to turn 10 to 15% of the European population, some 70 million people, into guardians of the environment. Yet in 2014, the policymakers saw little evidence that citizen science was useful to EU policymakers. At that time, a number of the EU directives actually prevented national governments from integrating citizen science data into reporting mechanisms. The prevailing view at that time was that citizen science had little relevance to policy making. It was recognized it might have social, educational, and research opportunities, but it wasn't seen as providing the data and the information that policymakers required to justify new environmental policy. It did not provide the mechanisms to either monitor the existing legislation or identify new environmental challenges. And many believed, and you still hear this, that the data provided was unreliable. The question therefore remained, were the ideas of the original citizen scientists and the pioneering researchers and politicians a pipe dream? Or is the potential of citizen science to support policymakers real? And I can vividly remember going to scientific meetings in Europe where scientists from Oxford and Cambridge told me, great stuff, Martin, but the kiss of death to an academic career to get involved in citizen science. That was the resistance, if you like, to engaging with the public in drawing them in to scientific research on a sufficiently large enough scale to make it attractive to policymakers. I also heard from policymakers who said citizen science is like a fireworks display. You light the firework, it goes off, it looks great for a couple of years, and then it's gone. And so these were the attitudes that had to be overcome. Can I ask everybody here if you have a mobile phone? Does anybody not have a mobile phone here? Well, of course, then that makes everybody who has a mobile phone potentially a citizen scientist. Because citizen science isn't new. It's been around since the Victorian era. What is new is the technology that facilitates and enables so many people to take part. And I had the joy this year of going to CERN and meeting one of the inventors of the World Wide Web and listening to the story about an individual making such a change in the way we run our lives is inspirational. And in some respects, that's exactly what citizen science is now becoming. It becomes potentially an inspirational opportunity for change. And in Ireland, nearly 90% of Irish adults own a mobile phone. Some 71% of them use it for social media activities. So you have a link direct, potentially, from research activity to the citizens of the country, and hopefully to the policymakers that follows. So there's a great opportunity to engage ordinary citizens in citizen science. But to do so, you need to use the internet and growing AI systems to not only engage citizens to collect real-time data, but to use that data, have it validated and return to them as information that they can use to mitigate risks in their daily lives. It's not enough just to gather data from people. You won't sustain people's interest if that's all you do. The information that's coming back to citizens needs to be done on a daily basis. Now, that's a very different way to traditional research where you gather information, you gather data, you assess and you understand it. You come to the end of the research project and you write a paper and you give the results back to individuals. This is moving on the run. And it's very unnerving for people who get involved in that in large-scale citizen science programs. But the reason it matters is that the information is being used by people on a routine basis. They will then give you more information. And the level of engagement that you can achieve will vary clearly from different citizen projects. And the type of engagement will vary enormously. I think you've heard from Mookie about the different levels of engagement that you can achieve. But things like simply agreeing to share data from your phones. There's a lovely project in Sydney in Australia where you can elect to allow your phone to tell the city authority your commute journeys. And they use that in traffic flow management. And in return, you get back information to tell you where all the traffic jams are, the roads to avoid, to help you with your daily commute. That's, if you like, passive engagement. And you can go right to the other end of the chain to positive engagement, where the citizens will get involved in helping to shape and make the research project itself and everything in between. And this diversity of citizen science is one of our problems and also one of our opportunities, because it means that when you come to do searches for citizen science, you have to use lots of different words to catch all the citizen science projects. But was that early optimism of the citizen scientists that we could deliver 10 to 17% of the population and engage them in citizen science, has it proven to be real? The answer is it's patchy, but there are some really good examples of really good citizen science projects producing really good data that give us hope for the future. And I wanted to share a few with you. This is an example here where the regulators are beginning to understand that if you fill the current democratic deficit with much of our legislation or our international agreements and engage with citizens, that you can implement our environmental laws at a faster pace. And the air quality case demonstrates this from the city of the city of Antwerp in Flanders in Belgium. Just imagine you're the citizen scientists running this program to improve air quality monitoring and expand it in the city of Antwerp. And you're looking for, you optimistically think, maybe 10, 15, 20,000 people to get involved. And 50,000 people respond who offer to support you. They give you the potential to have the greatest density of air quality monitoring sites of any city in Europe. But boy, do they give you a headache, because you never expected to get that level of response. You haven't got the budget to service 50,000 people. But never mind, the citizens think this is important enough that they will actually pay for their own monitoring devices. And yes, it's an affluent country and it wouldn't work everywhere in the world, but people actually paid to join the program. So you now have this opportunity to look in real detail at the air quality standards that exist in that city. And the citizens demand back data and information. And this is an example here at a pop festival, where they're actually giving information back on air quality in the city. And in return, the citizens can then mitigate and avoid air quality problems that nobody knew existed, identified by the citizens within the city in the canyon effects on the commute runs. But then it goes a stage further. The individuals who are involved in these programs start to realize that they're living and working in an air quality scenario that is damaging to their health. You're breaching World Health Authority limits on air quality. and they start a debate because they start to realize they're part of the problem. That the reason there is poor air quality in the city of Antwerp is because of the commute patterns and the vehicles that they drive. And they start to ask the question, how can I improve the air quality in my city? They start to change their own personal behaviors. A simple example might be if you cycle to work, you avoid the worst canyons because they now have that data available. And they say they started to recognize that they're part of the problem. Now, I told this story at an event called United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the highest decision-making body in the world for environmental implementation of international agreements. And I didn't know, but standing behind me was the Belgian ambassador to the UN, who interrupted me and said, not only did it change behaviors of the citizens, he said, but the citizens demanded of their politicians that they do something about air quality in Antwerp. And he said the debate in Antwerp moved from worrying about migration to worrying about air quality, because air quality affects health, it affects your children, it affects youngsters. And people die early because of poor air quality. So he said it changed the whole nature of the debate. And it didn't stop there. Imagine if we could take this idea from Antwerp and apply that to all the major cities across the globe. And when you realize that air quality kills more people than COVID-19 does in a year, how powerful it would be and how it would support our international agreements on air quality if we could expand what they did in the city of Antwerp. Can it be done? Can we scale up? Well, the Netherlands gives you an example. Yes, you can. The Netherlands has now scaled up a national program where citizen scientists have built on this experience and are now monitoring air quality across the whole country. The data is now integrated into official air quality monitoring data sets and has identified areas of poor air quality in the north of the Netherlands where nobody knew it existed, not previously predicted by the national air quality models. And in the Netherlands, what they've done is they've fed the information back to improve the modeling that they do for air quality. In other words, they've embraced the citizen science data, incorporated it into improving their air quality models, and they continue to drive improvements in air quality forward. I can think of other parts of the world where the data would not be welcome. And I go back to my own country not so long ago when we were in the EU and the UK was being prosecuted under infraction proceedings for failure to deliver on the Air Quality Framework Directive. The citizen data would not have been welcomed. So that's a tension that you often find between policymakers and citizen science. So the question for me again in Europe is whether the Netherlands example can be scaled up to the European level. And I know the people involved in the Netherlands and how they got the program in place. They had a huge battle internally within the regulator in the Netherlands, because again, the citizens who participate in this demand information back, and they demand it back on a regular basis. You can't simply take the data, analyze the data, report to your minister, and produce an annual report. They want it back on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, or even quicker. And that's uncomfortable for a regulator when you start identifying problems you didn't know existed, and then you have to brief your minister to explain why it is that you couldn't predict accurately where air quality problems were. And then, of course, you've also got the Air Quality Framework Directive obligations that you have to meet. So you have to change. So it becomes a driver. It keeps your government honest. It keeps driving the solutions forward. Let me give you another example. This is more up to date. This is now citizen science and water quality monitoring in the UK. So we continue to see progress where we're focusing citizen science resources to impact policy. I often hear people talk about citizen science. It's a research project. It will lead to research papers. But actually what we all want to see it do is drive policy change. And in the UK, political parties are now beginning to feel the heat from citizen scientists who are being engaged to track the poor quality of rivers in England and Wales. This is the River Wye. It's the only river in the UK that is a site of special scientific interest from source to mouth. And the river is now full of algae. It's polluted polluted by a mixture of sewage and polluted by intensive chicken farms that have been allowed to develop along its route. So it's a really important river in the UK. And people are now outraged at the level of pollution that is going on, not just in this river, but right across the English southern counties, particularly, where sewage overflows have been exceeding their limits, where monitoring has been ratcheted back, and the information has not been provided by the regulator. And the citizen scientists are stepping in to the vacuum. And boy, watch the results tomorrow in the local elections. It's a big issue now on the doorstep, because citizens now begin to understand the issue by getting engaged in the problem, by helping with the monitoring, and they drive change. Okay, what about at the EU level? Well, from 2013, when citizen science wasn't on the agenda, 2014, when the policymakers thought it was irrelevant, we have now seen a fundamental change. The EU has understood the opportunity that citizen science presents, and we're seeing a policy shift on citizen science away from those 2014 views. Citizen science, as this slide shows, is being slowly integrated into the EU policy developing process. And we can now point to our first success. As a result, the first piece of legislation has been passed based on citizen science data. And that is the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which is where they've used citizen science data to identify those plastics most often found on the seashores, on the river edges, in the marine oceans, based on citizen science data. Because the methodologies, the data gathering systems have been robust enough to provide real data that they can use in the legislative process. And more examples will surely follow. As we go forward, what is critical for citizen science is to ensure that the citizen science community learns from the experience of others, that we share methodologies, that we share software systems, that we share data management systems, that we share mobile app systems, and so forth, that we encourage scaling up of programs from the best examples across Europe. And that's where platforms like the EU Citizen Science platform are so important. It's now operated by the European Citizen Science Association. They were part of the consortium that helped to build it. And it's why, if you're a member of the European Citizen Science Association, you can influence its development. There is now a working group taking the development of the platform forward, and any member of ECSA can become a member of the working group. If you're trying to build on the experience of individual 3 or 4 year funded Horizon projects, this is the place to put the information. So the working parties of ECSA are a good example of the way you can start to drive the whole citizen science debate. They're places where you can share your experiences, you can learn from ECSA on their regular newsletters, and you can network with fellow citizen scientists. And you can also join the biannual EU Citizen Science Congress, next planned the 7th to 10th of April 2024 in Vienna, Austria. And there will shortly be a call for people who want to present papers at that Congress. Let me now turn to the international policymaking process. This is something that many people do not fully understand. They do not understand how you develop international policy. And this work is going on the whole time. We see the occasional reporting on the media from major events at the UN. But to get to those major events, discussions and drafting of potential international agreements are running the whole time between the two major events. The various COPs that you see for biodiversity, for climate change. Between each COP, there is work going on behind the scenes. And if you want to influence these, you have to understand that policy-making process. What we found at the international level is that the UN has slowly begun to realize the potential power of citizen science. And the reason is that we've shown them some examples. They've glimpsed the opportunity of what can be achieved by practical projects, both in the global north and the global south. One of the first examples tackled mosquito monitoring in Europe. Why would we be really interested in mosquito monitoring in Europe? Well, because of climate change, species such as the tiger mosquito, capable of carrying viruses such as dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, are migrating into Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and have reached as far as the Netherlands. Citizen science programs have demonstrated that data sets on the changing distribution of the species can be obtained faster, cheaper, at a greater granularity, in other words, more sampling points, and as accurately as conventional monitoring approaches. In fact, they can monitor places the official monitoring network cannot reach. They can identify populations of the mosquito that in a disease outbreak then need to be controlled. And then you start to link it to health. And I had the joy of bringing together 4 or 5 of the mosquito monitoring programs in Europe who were not talking to one another, all using citizen science data, into the same room with people from the global south who have major disease problems with the mosquitoes. And we were told that we would not be able to identify common citizen science methodologies in 4 or 5 years. We did it in 3 days. And the reason was because people were in the room saying, we don't care what the methodology is. We just want to take what you're doing and apply it in Cyprus. We want to apply it in South America. We want to apply it in Africa because it will help us to deal with some of the consequences of the disease outbreaks that we get. So don't squabble amongst yourselves about what the methodology is. Just decide on them, tell us, and we'll use them. And we've now already seen examples of the mosquito alert program from Spain migrating to Pakistan. We've seen examples in Cyprus, with the British Armed Forces have used these methodologies to understand where the risks are. The other one is the one on the left, which is also quite interesting, because these are 2 different methodologies. On the right, you actually do identification of the tiger mosquito. It's relatively simple to do. On the left, they're monitoring mosquito bites. What they found in the Netherlands is once they started a program monitoring mosquito bites, there was huge interest in the media. And they started to run on the national news. They would have the weather forecast, the pollen count, and the mosquito bite count. And this drove the citizen scientists who were involved in it nearly mad, because the interest it generated was enormous. People stopped visiting country parks where there were major biting episodes of mosquitoes, and the land managers would contact the scientists to say, what do we do about this? No one's coming anymore. You're affecting the usage of the countryside. And so there was a whole debate started about what you might do to mitigate the risks from mosquito bites. But imagine that was a disease outbreak in Italy where they were doing the same thing. You could actually cause the economic, if you like, demand for recreation in major tourist resorts. You could turn it off overnight. So again, there are risks associated with doing these type of studies from the citizen science component. Anyhow, the Global South is really interested in this type of work. UNEP could see the value and encourage citizen scientists to explore how such citizen science programs could be developed to support global policy. Leading much of this initial work was a loose network of the global citizen science community, prepared to engage with the global policy process, to explore how the democratic deficit in international policy could be tackled. And UNEP encouraged the loose association to set up as a new NGO. And 3 years on, so we've moved that whole process forward to bring focus for this work with additional support from an organization called ECSA, who's based in Vienna, the Citizen Science Center in Zurich University, and with the support of the universities of Geneva and Boku, Vienna. And here is now the Citizen Science Global Partnership. This was established literally in November, December of 2022. It's now forming, it has its own board. It has membership from Australia, Asia, America, Africa, Europe, and South America. Because in the time from 2013 to today, those are all the different associations that have formed around the world. And they're all incorporated NGOs, except the last one, which is RECAP, which covers South and Central America, which is a looser assembly at the moment, but we'll move in the same direction. And you can see that the organizations that are supporting it here are quite substantive. If you've not come across ECSA, it was the research institute set up at the point of the détente between Russia and America. And it's a joint American-Russian research institute, which has then grown to take in a whole range of additional countries who fund international research. What we've also seen on the international stage is a recognition that you need a framework to build citizen science into international agreements. And there have been a number of them that have been changing over time. And I'm just going to give you one example here. So in 2017, the first ministerial statement took place at UNEA, and you will not believe the joy that the citizen scientists had when the words citizen science were left in UNEA 3 in the ministerial statement. If anybody gets involved in these international agreements, they will know until the night before, till 3 o'clock in the morning, they are arguing about the words that will be included. And we watched the citizen science sentence shrink from 2 sentences to 1. And then we watched the wording eaten away until there was virtually only the words citizen science left. But it survived. It was the first recognition that citizen science had a place in international agreements. 2022, the first multilateral agreement to include citizen science in it was signed. And this is the biodiversity agreement that was signed in Montreal in December of 2022. Nobody quite knows yet in the member states how they're going to implement it, although in Ireland, you're in a great position to implement the monitoring of the biodiversity strategy because you have really good systems in place, as we do in the UK, for engaging citizens in biological monitoring. But then the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation came along in 2021 and changes to the Aarhus Convention the same year. And the Aarhus Convention changes were about the right to collect environmental data. Aarhus was all about the rights to access environmental information, but the changes, and Mookie was very heavily involved in this, to actually build in the right to collect environmental information. And we think about what would get in the way of collecting environmental information, and we think about the autocratic regimes in the world, where people might prevent citizens collecting data. And yes, we have examples. We have examples in China, where water quality monitoring citizen science programs were shut down by the regional administration because they gave an inconvenient truth in the data that they were providing. But let's not be too smug, because in the developed north, we can also find examples. And water quality is another example in the United States of America, where attempts were made to shut down citizen science programs in the far west by economic means, by legal means, and by changing the law of the state. So it's not just the autocratic regimes, and that's why the Aarhus Convention changes were so important. So the right then exists for the signatories to the Aarhus Convention then to enable their citizens to collect environmental data. The Open Science Recommendation is fascinating because what it's trying to do is to encourage all the citizen science programs to be able to use all the information they provide, all the tools, all the techniques, all the databases in like a Wikipedia type approach, where you share them through common platforms so that nobody has to reinvent the wheel if they want to tackle a similar problem globally. And we're now working through the Citizen Science Global Partnership on how you implement that in detail and provide a proper framework to be able to take that forward. We're also working with UNEP on something called the World Environment Situation Room. Now, if you've not seen it, go Google it. It's a global source of data on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a huge framework for the world to follow to be able to improve the lives of ordinary citizens. It has huge data gaps in it, which citizen science can help fill. The World Environment Situation Room is the state of the nation, the state of the globe in terms of where we are in environmental data. And we're now working with UNEP to build a portal in there for citizen science so that we can actually link what goes on at national level with regional level and global level. So you think about, I can give you the example in Europe, the Austrian citizen science platform, the European citizen science platform, and then the global. And so the idea is that anybody can then pick up ideas from one part of the world and apply it elsewhere. So go back to the air quality example. It should be possible for anybody in India who has an air quality problem to be able to pick up the ideas that have been developed in the Netherlands, look at what's appropriate for them in India, and then apply them in like a franchised way in India. Do we have some more case examples where we can demonstrate that the potential for global programs? And again, I believe we do. And the one I often quote is the COVID example. This was during the COVID pandemic in the UK, as in many other countries, real-time data on the disease was lacking. And a citizen science health-based program from the King's College London and with the startup company Zoe set up a system to track the disease and its symptoms in 3 days. Okay, they had a start, they got some software systems that they could use. They launched the program, and within a week, 1 week, they had 1.5 million people taking part. Yes, COVID was an exceptional example, but even they were blown away by the number of people that were willing to engage. And the project challenged government data. It attracted, or they tried to attract, funding from the government to run it, and the government declined. So as a consequence of that, they had some startup monies, but they were running out of funding. They were overwhelmed with the response that was coming in. Their servers nearly fell over by the demand that was being placed on them. And they were feeding data back on a daily basis at 3 o'clock every afternoon at a local authority level in granularity from the number of data points coming in. But because they were running out of money, they appealed to the citizens who were taking part. They were astounded. They ran 2 calls for crowdsourced funding, each of which raised over £1 million. So they raised £2 million to keep the program running when lack of government funding threatened the program. The government then relinquished. The government recognized it couldn't walk away from the program and put money in as well. And to date, 4.5 million people have taken part in that program. And in my view, this is the type of program that should be in our global emergency plans for future pandemics. It should be embedded within the World Health Organization. Second one is one I'm working on at the moment, which is an EU-funded program to empower citizens to understand and deal with climate change. It tackles in particular economic issues, empowering citizens to develop and own their own community energy facilities, and also to map and reduce their own personal carbon footprint. It provides citizens with a personal trainer on what they need to do to stop being what I call fossil fuel fools. And for somebody who used to work for the oil industry, that's a big step for me to be taking. Because to continue to use fossil fuels at this point in time is sheer madness. It's a project that has the potential for global application across our major cities and goes to the heart of tackling the 30% of all carbon emissions that we are responsible for, and without which, if we don't tackle this, we will not be able to achieve our ambitions on climate change. If I can, come on. Yeah. The third example I want to give is taken from the global south. It's a bridging between the global north and the global south, because again, people often say, well, it's all right looking at citizen science in wealthy countries where you've got a big middle class, you've got excess income, but what about the hard places in the world? Well, this is a project to help tackle the hard places in the world. And it's called Project YOMA, and it's learning to earning. It's been built on the technology and methodologies from another project called Crowd for SDG, with funding from the Botnar Foundations. So this is a philanthropic organization, and it's working thanks to the Citizen Science Global Partnership by bringing people together from CSGP Africa and Citizen Science Europe. And it's helping young scientists to get involved. Initially, 3,000 young people in local citizen science challenges, helping local authorities to improve services through the monitoring work that they do. And it rewards participants with tokens redeemable for educational opportunities. So here's a reason to take part, because if life is difficult and you're struggling to put food on the table and you are being asked to take part in these type of activities, it's really important that there are good reasons why you would want to do so. And this type of program, I believe, has great potential to be expanded across the global south. Now, I could have given you other examples, so don't think this is just an isolated one. There's a fascinating project running now in the Amazon basin, where they're monitoring the fish populations across the whole of the Amazon basin. That's the protein source for people who live there. That's their food source. And that is working right across the Amazon basin, across 5 countries. And that's projects at scale that make a real difference. So that brings me to my last few slides, because I've gone on a little bit longer than I intended. I want to start to explore the challenges and opportunities for citizen science in support of international agreements. And you can read the slide, but let me just concentrate on 3 challenges. Many governments and government departments, as well as academia, simply do not trust citizen science data. Governments in particular are fearful of lack of control on data and information flow, and often do not have the skills to make citizen science programs work. I know that because I used to run national programs in the UK for the government to obtain data. And you analyze the data, you have all the answers that the minister wants to hear about the data before it ever goes public. You control the flow of information. With citizen science, you don't control the flow of information in that way. So it's a different way of working. Funding remains a challenge, not only for the limited research projects that run over 3 to 4 years, but for the long-term monitoring programs incorporated into the basic responsibilities of statutory organizations. Funding for global programs do not yet exist, and will only be found if we integrate citizen science into international agreements and the way they're implemented. We have a few examples of how this can be done. I gave you the example of air quality in the Netherlands, but the same thing has been done in Ghana for marine litter, for plastic litter, where they've been monitoring using citizen science data to be able to report on the SDGs and understand the scale of the problem that they've got. And it's fully integrated into the National Statistical Office reporting for Ghana. We also, lastly, I wanted to highlight, citizen science programs often remain highly fragmented and lack consistent methodologies. I've touched on this a little bit already. But those are the things that need to be shared and developed through the global frameworks. It is madness to have a project in New Zealand reinventing a methodology and a monitoring system when the same thing already exists in Europe, or the same thing exists in Australia. We need to share our information, share our methodologies, share our database systems in a much more open way. And a limited start has been made with methodologies for citizen science as part of the SDGs. And I learned this week that the World Data Forum in China was all about citizen science. And it was mandating the Statistical Office of the UN to start putting common methodologies together. And I don't say one methodology, because one thing that works in an affluent country like Germany may not work in a country like Kenya. You may need different methodologies for different parts of the world with different cultures and different technical support systems. But I do believe we're moving towards a global convention on citizen science, because we can mitigate the risks associated with citizen science by developing and adopting a global convention on citizen science that builds on the work of the Aarhus Convention, the UNESCO Open Science recommendations, and can be used to underpin including citizen science into all major international agreements. And if you look at this slide, again, I'll concentrate on three other critical areas. Global rights and protections for citizens to collect and gather data on the environment. If you collect data as a citizen scientist in Indonesia on illegal logging, you risk your life. If you do the same on sand extraction in India, you risk your life. So there's a fundamental understanding needed that if you're a citizen, you are protected in the way that you collect data. That needs to be tackled. The Indonesian problem was solved by using students in the USA, satellite imagery, and teams on the ground, enforcement teams on the ground. And it's quite a complicated program, but it's a lovely example of how you can bring different citizen scientists together from across the world to help monitor a local problem in Indonesia. And it sometimes staggers citizen scientists that when you launch a program like they did in Queensland, for instance, on monitoring on the Great Barrier Reef, that you get responses from all across the world. Because citizens are using the technology to get engaged in things that they're interested in. Continental and global citizen science methodologies and tools, absolutely essential, that can be shared, and I keep saying this, and developed for critical citizen science programs. And we badly need examples that work at global scale. And I think air quality is the one that's probably going to come through first, because air quality can be more than environmental monitoring. It can also be health monitoring. And we now have had the first example of somebody affected by air quality who lost their life in England directly linked to air quality. Can you imagine the power of applying the COVID type sampling and analysis method to the health effects of air quality to the actual air quality monitoring data? It is potentially explosive for governments to get involved in that sort of thing, but for citizens, it will drive real uptake. And if you see the quality of air in some of the developing cities around the world, you'll understand what I mean. Then there's an issue around intellectual property rights. It may seem a strange one to focus on, but what we're seeing is the value of citizen science data is growing. If you're involved in the pharmaceutical industry, you'll understand the potential of citizen science to understand people's actual individual health issues. That can be fed into pharmaceutical research. So protecting the property rights, the value of citizen science data is something that has to be tackled if we want open science and open science systems to be working. And then we need obligations on all the parties to all the conventions that are passed to integrate citizen science data into national statistical data sets. Because until we do that, there are no national drivers to encourage the uptake of citizen science in a routine way, in the way information is gathered. So it's not enough just to put citizen science as an obligation into international agreements. We have to go further and guide member states in the development of frameworks to support and fund citizen science programs across member states. And we also need to recognize that new skill sets are going to be needed to achieve success. And one of those is also recognizing in the academic world that citizen science is a real science. It's a way of engaging in the community in which you live. And it's a really powerful tool to increase the scale, the depth, the penetration of the work that you're doing. So we are the first generation that's had a unique opportunity to empower millions of people to collect data and information on a scale and a density we've failed to achieve through normal scientific research. You can advance me by one more. A couple of events you might be interested in seeing. Something called EU Green Week. This year is about empowering and skilling citizens to become drivers towards a climate neutral and sustainable Europe through citizen science. We're bringing together 4 or 5 citizen science research programs to present what they're doing at EU Green Week. And we're bringing in keynote speakers from the UN and the EU to introduce the session. So again, the slides are with you here, so you can get the registration link. That's due to go, the link is live, but the program's due to go live any day now. And then the other one is the UN Science Policy Business Forum, the Sustainable Research Congress. It's actually taking place in Panama. but it's an online event, and it will be looking at citizen science and data for decision making. And you'll see a lot more events like this now. Citizen science seems to be everywhere. It's a case of really trying to pick out the events that really matter. Two last slides to finish. The sort of work that we're doing in citizen science really matters. And I always look at this slide. It's taken from 6.4 billion kilometers looking back in our solar system at Earth. And that tiny dot at the bottom is Earth. It's the only inhabitable planet in the solar system. And it's why we need more people to volunteer, to really engage in citizen science, to work with the Citizen Science Global Partnership, to work with the European Citizen Science Association, and if you're from other parts of the world, to find your local association and get involved, because the decade of citizen science is here. And I believe you're going to hear a lot more about it over the next 10 years as it starts to underpin the way we deliver our international agreements. Thank you very much.